winter of 2005 was unlike any I'd ever experienced. I was a junior in high school, living in a quiet little town tucked deep in upstate New York. Snow was nothing new for us, but the storm that year felt different, angrier, relentless, and somehow alive. It started innocently enough, with lazy flurries drifting down that Friday morning as I sat in chemistry class, half listening to the drone of my teacher. By midday, those gentle flakes had morphed into a wall of white fury. The school announced an early dismissal, and I couldn't have been happier to trudge home, out of the bitter cold. Yet, even then, as the snow whipped against my face, there was something unsettling about how quiet it all seemed. Like the storm was stealing the very sound from the world. By Saturday morning, the snowdrifts had swallowed the streets, and the power was out. Our old wood stove became the centerpiece of my family's weekend survival plan. Huddled together, we played board games and shared stories to pass the time. Outside, the storm wrapped everything in an eerie, pristine white stillness. But something about that stillness felt unnatural. It pressed against the house, seeping through the walls, carrying with it a weight I couldn't explain. Sunday dawned in fragile silence. The blizzard had finally given way to a pale, lifeless sky. I decided to take my sled to the hill behind our house, desperate to shake off the strange unease that had settled over me. As I stepped outside, the sheer quietness of it all struck me again. No chirping birds, no rustling trees. My boots crunched loudly in the snow, the only sound in a world gone mute. For a time, sledding brought a fleeting sense of joy. I hurtled down the hill, laughing as the frigid wind bit at my cheeks. But my happiness was short-lived. On my third trip down, I spotted them strange tracks in the untouched snow at the base of the hill. At first glance, I thought they were animal tracks, but as I moved closer, the hair on the back of my neck prickled. These prints weren't normal. They were large, vaguely human, but grotesquely distorted. Long lines trailed behind them, as if something had dragged itself through the snow. Curiosity overtook caution. Without thinking, I followed the tracks as they wound toward the woods. The trees loomed taller and darker as I ventured further, their snow-laden branches creaking in the still air. The trail twisted erratically, leading me deeper into the forest, where the shadows felt heavier, almost alive. Then I saw it, a clearing. In its center stood an old, decaying shed, half buried under mounds of snow. Its crooked frame sagged under years of neglect, and the door hung slightly ajar, swaying with an almost deliberate rhythm. A chill, far colder than the icy air around me, gripped my chest as I approached. The world seemed to hold its breath. Just as I reached the door, a faint noise seeped out, wet, guttural, like someone struggling to draw breath. My heart pounded, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Something compelled me forward, something beyond my control. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Darkness spilled out to meet me, thick and suffocating. For a moment, I thought the shed was empty. Then, my eyes adjusted to the gloom. It sat hunched in the far corner, a figure barely human. Its twisted limbs were splayed unnaturally, the flesh marred by frost and dirt. Shaggy patches of dark, matted hair clung to its skeletal frame. And its eyes, oh God, Its eyes gleamed with a lifeless, glassy desperation that rooted me to the spot. The air thickened with the sound of its breathing, raspy, wheezing, each inhale a tortured effort. "Help me," it whispered. The voice was faint, layered with something inhuman. It crackled in my ears, soft but shattering. My legs turned to jelly as I stumbled backward, my chest tightening in panic. Then it moved. With a jerking, unnatural speed, the figure lunged toward me, and I caught sight of its teeth, jagged, broken things that didn't belong in a human mouth. I bolted. The forest around me blurred as I fled, the sharp branches clawing at my jacket and tearing at my skin. The whispers followed me, rising in intensity, an unbearable chorus of pleading and mocking voices that made my blood run colder than the snow underfoot. When I finally reached my house, I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. I gasped for air, barely able to explain what had happened to my family. They just laughed it off, teasing me about letting the storm play tricks on my mind. But the terror in those woods was no trick. A few days later, news spread through our small town. A man, a local drifter with no family, had gone missing during the storm. His body was discovered frozen in the woods, close to the clearing I had stumbled upon. The authorities said he died of exposure, but I knew better. The shed was gone when I returned to the clearing later that week. Only pristine snow remained, as if it had never been there. To this day, when the winter winds howl and the snow falls heavy, I hear the whispers. They scratch at the edges of my mind, calling me back to that clearing, back to the silence of the snow. And deep down, I know the storm was just the beginning. Something waits out there. Something hungry. 2. I think I encountered the black-named kids. I have always been a sucker for horror from a young age, and I always loved it. Until a month ago. It was night, and I was sitting in my cluttered living room with my cat, and I was reading some stuff on the r/Nosleen subreddit. This was like horror gasoline to my campfire, and I loved it. I was scrolling through some stories when I came across a story about a guy encountering some strange kids. He said they were twin boys with sickly pale skin and black eyes. I snorted and closed the story. I was mildly creeped out by this, but I brushed it off casually. My blinds were always closed, since I was basically an energy drink-fueled vampire and seldom opened them. I was in a pretty safe neighborhood, so I never had to worry about people kicking down the door in the middle of the night. I was starting to get a bit tired when I heard my cat start growling. I asked her what was the matter, and she stayed by the couch, staring at the front door. And it wasn't an angry stare. It was a stare of fear. She never got scared like this before, so I just brushed it off. I got up and started getting ready for bed. I was about to take a shower when I heard a knock on the door. "Who's there?" I call out. No answer. I turn back towards the shower and I hear another knock. I let out a groan of frustration and marched towards the door clad in a towel. I looked out my peephole and saw 2 little kids, one looking older than the other and wearing winter coats. I couldn't see their faces. They were cast with shadows. "Hello," I said, and one of the kids said, "Can you let us in, miss?" said the oldest. "We're really hungry and cold." I started shaking a bit as I fumbled for the porch light switch. I flipped it a few times, but the light didn't come on. "I'm sorry, but I can't help you," I lied as I silently locked the door. "Please," said the youngest, "we'll die out here if you don't help us." I tried to get a better look at their facial features, and that's when I noticed it. They had sickly pale skin and black eyes. I started to back away slowly, and then they started banging on my door. My cat yowled in terror and ran into my bedroom. I ran to my bathroom, closed the door, and covered my ears from the loud, incessant banging. It continued for about a minute, then stopped. I uncovered my ears and went back to the door. I looked outside, and they were gone. It's been a month now, and I sleep with the lights on now. I'm afraid to go to sleep, but I'm also afraid that they'll come back. Maybe I imagined it, and I'm just being paranoid. Or maybe I did the right thing by not opening the door. Growing up, I was always fascinated by ancient books, works that had slipped through the cracks of history, their words untouched for centuries. To me, they were artifacts of forgotten lives, whispers from worlds long past. Unfortunately, I'd lived in a quiet, uneventful town where there wasn't much to fuel my curiosity, but tucked away in a narrow side street, in the forgotten part of town, there was a tiny antique shop, Clarkson's Curiosities. The shop was dusty, dimly lit, and packed to the brim with relics that seemed to hold pieces of untold stories. It was my sanctuary. The owner, Mr. Clarkson, was a grizzled man in his 60s, always dressed in a worn cardigan with patches at the elbows. His face was lined with wrinkles, but his eyes gleamed with the sharpness of someone who had seen more than he let on. "History isn't just dates and kings," he once said, sliding me a juice box as I sat cross-legged on the shop floor. "It's the life in the cracks. The stories no one bothered to remember." Mr. Clarkson loved to share the histories of his items. I'd spend hours there after school, riding my bike straight from class to the shop. I had seen nearly everything the store had to offer until one day I overheard him talking to another customer about the back room. "Don't go in there," he told me firmly the first time I asked. "That stuff isn't for young eyes. Some things are better left alone." Of course, those words only deepened my curiosity. One rainy afternoon, while Mr. Clarkson was distracted with a chatty customer, I saw my chance. My heart pounded as I slipped past the dusty curtain separating the main shop from the forbidden back room. It was cramped and dark, the air thick with the smell of aged wood and mildew. Stacks of boxes leaned precariously against the walls, and cobwebs draped over strange, forgotten artifacts. At first, I didn't see anything extraordinary, just more relics, gathering dust. But then, my eyes landed on a large book, half hidden beneath a pile of moth-eaten cloth. It was massive, with a cracked leather cover that looked like it had survived centuries. My 12-year-old hands trembled as I brushed away the dust. The spine was weak, the pages yellowed and curling at the edges. The writing inside was strange letters looping and twisting in ways I couldn't comprehend at the time. "What do you think you're doing?" Mr. Clarkson's voice boomed from the doorway, startling me so badly I dropped the book. He marched over, his face red with fury. "I told you not to come in here." I just wanted to see. You don't have permission to touch that." His hands shook as he picked up the book and cradled it like a wounded animal. "Get out of here, and don't ever go poking around where you don't belong." I didn't argue. I bolted, the sound of his angry muttering trailing behind me. That day never left me. Over the years, my fascination with ancient texts only deepened. I went on to study archaeology and specialized in medieval manuscripts. By the time I was nearing my master's degree, I could read Middle English fluently. But one thing lingered in my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch: the mysterious book from Clarkson's shop. For my thesis, I needed an original medieval text to translate and analyze. The memory of that book resurfaced, stronger than ever. I returned to my hometown after nearly a decade away. Clarkson's Curiosities was still there, though the paint on the sign had faded and the windows were cloudier than I remembered. Mr. Clarkson himself looked older, his movements slower, his face more sunken. "Back again, eh?" he said as I stepped into the shop, the bell above the door jingling softly. "Didn't think I'd see you around these parts anymore." "I'm finishing my degree," I explained. "Thought I'd drop by for old time's sake." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Not much has changed here." I made small talk, asking about some of the items on display, while subtly steering him toward the front of the shop. "Still got that old globe?" I asked, pointing to a corner. As he shuffled off to retrieve it, I slipped through the curtain into the back room. The layout hadn't changed. My heart raced as I scanned the clutter, and there it was, the book, still buried in the same spot. It felt heavier than I remembered, its leather cover cracked and cold to the touch. Without hesitation, I slid it into my bag and hurried back out. "Thanks for the chat, Mr. Clarkson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll stop by again soon." He muttered, watching me with narrowed eyes. That night, in the dim light of my dorm room, I finally opened the book. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded but legible. I realized the text wasn't ancient gibberish, it was Middle English. Here is what the text said. "Anno Domini 1347. I write now as the leaves fall from the trees, their gold and crimson hues painting the air with the promise of a cold winter. The world feels peaceful, as it always does in autumn, when the harvest is gathered and the granaries are full. Our kingdom thrives under the reign of King Edward III. Though I have never set eyes upon him, his name is whispered with admiration in every corner of the land. They say his court is a place of splendor, where knights clad in gleaming armor bow before him, and poets recite their verses in halls gilded with gold. Even here, in our little village of Ainsworth, we feel the warmth of his rule. Taxes are fair, the roads are safe, and the markets are lively with traders from distant lands. Ainsworth is no grand place, just a cluster of cottages nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills. But it is home. The fields are rich with barley, and the river runs clear and cold. The villages are as close as kin, each one ready to lend a hand or share a meal when times are hard. My family's cottage is small but sturdy, with a thatched roof and a garden that my mother tends with care. She says the herbs she grows, thyme, lavender, and rosemary, keep sickness away. My father is a carpenter, his hands roughened by years of shaping wood into tools and wagons. He speaks little, but his presence is steady, like the oak beams that hold up our house. And then there is my sister, Cecily, who never stops talking. At 12 years old, she is a whirlwind of mischief, forever running barefoot through the village and climbing trees with the other children. My days are filled with work and laughter. I rise with the sun to tend the sheep and gather firewood, but by the time the sun is high, I am free to join my friends. There is Henry, the baker's son, whose pockets are always filled with stolen pastries. Then there is Thomas, who dreams of becoming a knight, though his sword is little more than a stick he found in the woods. We spend our afternoons exploring the hills, racing each other through the meadows or skipping stones across the river. On Sundays, we gather in the village square to listen to the minstrels who pass through, their songs filling the air with tales of valor and romance. But the brightest part of my life is Eleanor. She is the miller's daughter, with hair the color of ripe wheat and eyes as green as the fields in spring. We have known each other since we were children, and it has always been understood that we would marry one day. Eleanor has a laugh that bubbles up like the river after a storm, and when she looks at me, it feels as though the rest of the world fades away. We spend hours walking together, talking of the future we will build, a cottage of our own, with a garden for her and a workshop for me. "You'll be the finest carpenter in the village," she said to me just yesterday. Her cheeks flushed from the chill in the air, and I'll bake bread that will make the king himself jealous. "Only if the king has teeth like a goat," I teased, earning myself a playful slap on the arm. The future seems as bright as the harvest moon. The village is bustling with preparations for the winter festival, a time of feasting and dancing. The air smells of roasting chestnuts and spiced cider, and the church bells ring out with a joyful clang. The monks from the abbey have brought word of the king's latest victory in France. The villagers cheer as they hear of our army's triumph, and even the priest smiles as he blesses the crowd. I often think that these are the best days of my life. There is no fear here, no shadow over our hearts. We work hard, we laugh harder, and we dream of tomorrow. I am 16 now, on the cusp of manhood. My father says I will take over his workshop soon, and Eleanor's father has already begun crafting the furniture for our future home. It feels as though everything is falling into place, as though nothing could ever change the peace and happiness we know. November. The air grows colder with each passing day, but life in Ainsworth continues as it always has. The harvest is in, the fires are lit, and the hearths glow with the warmth of winter preparations. The only shadow on our peaceful village is the whispers of sickness from towns far away. Henry first mentioned it after returning from the market in the next village. "They say there's an illness spreading," he told me as we sat by the river. "Comes with the rats. People fall sick, grow boils, and die within days." Rats. Our fields and barns have always had them, scurrying in the shadows and gnawing at the grain. What could be different now? "Stories," Thomas said, scoffing as he sharpened his stick sword against a rock. "Frightened fools love to make up tales to pass the time," I agreed. What sickness could possibly reach our quiet valley? We were safe here, hidden from the world. And so, I pushed the thought from my mind, focusing instead on my family and Eleanor. December 4th. It began with old Whittle Hargrove. She had always been frail, her face a maze of wrinkles, her back bent like a crooked tree. When she fell ill, no one thought much of it. Winter claims the old, as my father says. But then the boils appeared black and angry, swelling beneath her skin until they burst, oozing foul-smelling pus. Her coughing grew wet and thick, and within 3 days she was gone. The village buried her quietly, and life went on. Then it was the miller's boy and his young bride. They had been married not 3 months, their laughter still echoing through the square. Eleanor and I had danced at their wedding. Now they lay side by side in their cottage, their bodies twisted in agony, their faces unrecognizable beneath the blackened swellings. The priest said a blessing over them, his voice trembling. "Deus nos punire peccatis nostris." God is punishing us for our sins," he proclaimed, urging the villagers to gather in the church to repent. December 7th. I began to notice the rats everywhere. They seemed bolder, scurrying through the streets in broad daylight, their red eyes gleaming like embers. Eleanor said she had seen them in the mill, gnawing at the sacks of grain. "Don't touch them," my father warned. "They bring filth." But by then, it was too late. The Thompsons, our next-door neighbors, were the next to fall. Their youngest daughter cried in the street, her tiny hands gripping the hem of my tunic as she begged for help. "They're burning," she sobbed, her voice hoarse. I dared to step inside their home and immediately regretted it. The smell was unbearable, a rancid mix of sweat, blood, and decay. Mr. Thompson lay on the floor, his body convulsing, while his wife sat slumped in a chair, her face hidden beneath her hands. I could see the black sores on her arms, her flesh cracked and leaking. December 15th. I write this with shaking hands. My mother and Cecily have fallen ill. It began with a fever, their faces flushed and their bodies hot to the touch. Then came the boils, horrid black lumps that sprouted like weeds across their skin. My sister weeps constantly, her voice barely a whisper now, while my mother grows delirious, calling out to my father and to God. The coughing is the worst. It is deep and wet, rattling through their frail bodies as though it will tear them apart. Blood spills from their lips in dark, sticky rivulets. I sit by their bedsides, holding their hands, praying for their recovery. But in my heart, I know the truth, as he pleads with us to seek God's forgiveness. Come to God, for he punishes us for our sins, he cries, his voice breaking with despair. The church is packed, the air thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and fear. People wail and scream, their voices echoing off the stone walls. Some tear at their clothes, others flagellate themselves with whips, their backs striped with blood. They believe their suffering will appease God, will make him spare them, but the plague does not care for prayers. The streets are quiet now save for the cries of the dying and the soft scurrying of rats. Doors remain shut, windows boarded up. No one dares to leave their homes unless it is to carry another body to the mass grave at the edge of the village. Eleanor's father fell ill yesterday. She stays at his bedside, refusing to leave despite the risk. I long to see her, to hold her, but I cannot. My father forbids it, and deep down I know he is right. How did this happen? How did our thriving kingdom, our peaceful village, come to this? I fear it is only a matter of time before the plague takes us all. December 24th. There are strange men wandering through the village now, dressed in long robes, their faces hidden behind bird-like masks. The masks are made of dark leather, with long, curved beaks that seem to hold bundles of herbs or perfumes. They walk the streets in silence, their heavy cloaks dragging in the muck of the dirt roads. And every time they pass, the air grows thick with the scent of my mother's herbs. Cloves, cinnamon, and rosemary. Yet something darker lingers beneath. It smells of rot, as if the earth itself is decaying beneath our feet. They claim to be doctors, but I do not trust them. No, I don't think they are doctors at all. December 28th. Yesterday, I saw one of them near the town square. His mask was thick with dust, his eyes hidden beneath dark, round lenses. He held a long, wooden stick in his hand, and when someone, an old man, bent over with fever approached him, the doctor struck him across the back with it. The old man cried out, but the doctor didn't stop. He simply walked on, as if nothing had happened, leaving the man stumbling behind, beaten and humiliated. People still flock to them, though. Why? I cannot understand it. Perhaps they believe these bird-faced men hold some cure for the plague, some remedy hidden beneath their masks. They bring no potions, no healing herbs, no treatments. Instead, they only spread fear. They walk through our streets like gods, untouchable, wearing masks of death, but not once have I seen them treat anyone. All they do is slap their sticks on the ground, demanding the sick stay back, yelling words in Latin that no one understands. "Stay back, filthy wretches," they bark, pushing the sick and desperate away. I watched one of them last week as he went into the home of a woman I once knew. Oh. She had fallen ill with the plague, her skin blackened and swollen. I saw him enter her door, but when he came out, he didn't look at her once. He didn't even bend down to check if she still lived. He turned his head as if he had seen nothing, gave her house a quick glance, and walked away without a word. Her body lay in that room for days before the village saw fit to bury her. January 5th. The villagers are desperate, as we all are. They have no other choice but to believe that these men in masks have the answers. They say the doctors bring with them the air of life, whatever that means. But I think it's nothing more than a lie. I believe these masked figures are causing the very sickness they claim to heal. I wonder if they are the true cause of this plague, spreading it with every step they take, their poisons and perfumes carried by the winds they stir. I heard a rumor today from Thomas. He overheard the village priest speaking to Father Edmund in hushed tones. They believe the doctors are part of a larger conspiracy, a group hired by the king himself to cleanse the kingdom. They are here to control the people, to make them suffer in their own desperation. I cannot fathom why the king would allow such people into our homes, our streets. The people grow sicker each day, but still, we are told to trust the doctors. But I cannot trust them. How can I? January 8th. It was this morning that I saw one of the masked doctors in front of our house. My father stood at the door, his arms crossed, watching the doctor as he came up the lane. He was tall, his mask black and sharp, looking like something from a nightmare. The doctor's eyes, behind the dark lenses, were unreadable, hollow. The doctor stopped in front of our house and began to raise his stick, but my father stepped forward. "You will not come near us," my father said, his voice firm but shaking. The doctor did not reply. Instead, he swung his stick at my father's leg, knocking him to the ground. I rushed to him, but the doctor raised his stick again, a threat in his eyes. Without a word, he turned and walked away, as though we were nothing more than pests beneath his feet. I stayed with my father, helping him to his feet, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He, too, knows something is terribly wrong. January 12th. Now, as I write this, I cannot shake the feeling that these doctors have brought more than just sickness to our door. They bring fear, they bring distrust, and I believe that they themselves are not just a symbol of this plague, they are its spreaders. If they are the cause of this, I do not know how we can stop it. No one can say no to them. They have power, they are untouchable, and if the king has sent them, perhaps he knows more than we do about their purpose. I do not know how much longer I can stand by and watch as my village crumbles. The plague spreads like wildfire, and these doctors walk among us, untouched, spreading more than just death. They are spreading despair. God help us. January 13th. I awoke this morning to the sound of silence, an emptiness that clung to the air, like the fog creeping in through the cracks of the window. I rose from my bed, feeling the weight of dread pressing down on me. The coldness of the room mirrored the emptiness in my heart. My family, once so full of life, lay quiet and still. I needed water. I had to get out for a moment. Maybe the fresh air would clear my mind. Let me forget the sickness that had taken over this house, this town, this world. I was gone only a short while, but when I returned, everything had changed. The door to my house was slightly ajar, and as I stepped inside, a nauseating smell hit me. The stench of decay, of death. I hesitated. Something wasn't right. I walked into the kitchen and froze in place. A doctor, one of those cursed men in the bird mask, stood in the center of the room. He was leaning over a table, and I could see, with horror, what he was doing. Rats. Dozens of them. They scurried across the floor, driven by the doctor's hand. They were being let loose into my home. Why? I choked out, my voice barely above a whisper. The doctor turned slowly, as if surprised to see me. Without a word, he reached for his stick and swung it at my chest. The force knocked me backward. Deus te oblitus est, he muttered, though the words felt like ice on my skin. The words were cold, without care, without humanity. I tried to stand, but the pain in my ribs was too much. Blood pooled in my mouth. I barely had time to raise my hands in defense before he struck me again. When he left, I was left bleeding on the floor. But the rats, they had already begun their work. The doctor, or whatever he truly was, had sealed our fates. I crawled inside, but by the time I made it back to my family, it was too late. My mother and father, the sister, they were all lying in their beds, their skin mottled with boils and discolored patches. Blood spurted from their mouths in torrents, and their bodies convulsed in their final moments. I heard the gurgling, the choking sounds. My sister's body was racked with coughs, her face twisted in pain, the blood splattering her pale skin. I could not do anything. I should have saved them, but how? I couldn't even touch them without recoiling. Their eyes, vacant and wide, stared at me as I screamed for help that would never come. And then I heard it, the sound I had longed to hear amidst the chaos. Her voice, my love. She appeared in the doorway, her hand trembling as she reached for mine. She was coughing, her breath ragged, but there was still a fire in her eyes. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to save her, but the sickness had already begun to work its way into her veins, into her lungs. Without thinking, we fled. We ran as far as we could, but it didn't matter. The village was falling. The plague had already claimed my family, my friends. We found a small house at the edge of the town. Its walls were weak, the roof sagging, but we hid there, together. It was all I could do. But I knew, deep down, it was already too late. Her coughs grew worse. Blood stained the cloth she held to her lips. I held her hand, feeling her pulse slow with each breath she took. I felt it too. The sharpness in my chest, the burning fever. January 20th. I can't stand it any longer. This world is over. There is nothing left but darkness. I write this with my last breath, cursing anyone who dares to read these words. May the plague follow you. May it haunt you. May it consume your family, your lover, your village, just as it has consumed mine. I am nothing now. I will be forgotten. But you will carry this curse. And if there is any justice in this forsaken world, you will meet the same fate I have. I will die today, and I will take the last of my hope with me. May God have mercy on my soul. January 22nd, I close my eyes now, and all I hear is the rasp of her breath. And then, nothing. The diary's final pages were smudged with blood. The ink had bled together, leaving only a garbled mess of letters. But it didn't matter. The teenager had already sealed his fate, and now, my fate, too, seems uncertain.